I'm working with GIS for a long time, so I'm show how I use GIS to expand the inquiry of the past, or the geography of the past in this case. The brief agenda is what is the motivation about doing historical GIS for, in this case, the Canadian Prairies, which the data and methodology I use, the context of the historical analysis, the GIS analysis, and the conclusion. So from the 1850 to about 1914, about 5 million immigrants arrived in Canada. So it doesn't mean that all the immigrants settled in Canada. So some, a great number used Canada as a port of entrance and immediately moved to the south. So by 1910, about 1 million Canadians were living in the US. And for that, the statistics are very fuzzy, but some say that they were people that were transient in Canada and in the US border were counted as Canadians, and others say that, well, they are actually Canadians that they were living in Canada. So they are not a coincidence in the data that you collect about how many people arrive in Canada and how people settle in Canada. Some of those settle in the open space of the Canadian Prairie that the government opened for settlement after 1870. So the question that I'm asking is the number of homestead records that we can collect from historical sources are a good indication of the development of the Canadian Prairies. So it's the number of the homestead entries that immigrants applied for during the period is a good indicator of the region's economic development. So for that, I use historical GIS to understand that pattern of settlement during the period. And if that pattern can show Western Canada transformation in time and space. Of course, the question that I'm asking, so I'm not the only one that asked before. So other scholars asked a similar question during the year. So some used census records to count how many people live in that area in that particular day of when the census was taken. Others used the records of the Dominion Lands offices, the aggregated data. So they used the data that particularly we published in the Historical Statistics of Canada, the edition of 1965, which is a very important book, but the data on homestead records are incomplete. So others, to complete those partial understanding of the statistic, used econometrics, and well, then things are going to be more fuzzy, because econometrics are, well, you can manipulate some statistics doing some econometrics. So what I propose is to revise the homestead entries and cancellation during the period of high settlement in the prairie by analyzing the records for the individual land offices that open in the prairie during the time. So the data that I collected was mostly textual records from the Dominion Lands offices, which were published in the report of the Minister of the Interior that came within the seasonal papers of Canada. I used also the post office's records that appear in the report of the Postmaster General of Canada during the period. I used historical maps. I georeferenced historical map from the collection that is online at the University of Manitoba at Flickr. I used geographies to obtain the actual railroad network. So using textual records, historical textual records, I reconstructed the historical railroad network from 1878, that the first the first branch that appeared in Winnipeg, until 1914. Some of the town's village names disappeared over the years, so became ghost towns. So I tried to track down those names using geographical names, topographic maps, and the names of the historical railroad stations, etc. For the for the townships shapefile, I used the work that they are doing, the Canadian Century Research Infrastructure. So they are mapping the Census of Canada from 1911 to 1961, I think. I'm not clear which, if they ended doing that. This is important because the census of 1911 used the township as a census of district. So it is more clear to see the pattern of settlement there. So they are using a sample of the census, not the full census record. So there are there is the census of 1881. This is available online, and they are trying to put into the townships area. But this is very difficult because before the 1911 census, the census districts were different. There were different changes in the district. So this is very difficult to follow the division, the census division from one census to the other, because the period from 1871, the year of the first national census, to the 1911, the fourth census, the districts changed. There was a very dynamic period where new towns appeared, so the village appeared. So village in Saskatchewan, for instance, mushroom. About 300 village appeared in Saskatchewan from the one census to the other. So this is very difficult to follow up the records and to assess how many settlers arrived or settled in one region. So let's see some context, brief historical context about Canada. So in 1850, Canada was more a dream than a country. So we see that the whole country was the property of the Hudson's Bay Company. So we have Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick in the east, which was Canada. The rest was, well, the Red River settlement in here, and Vancouver Island in the west. So the rest was really the post of the Hudson's Bay Company. So the immigration in Canada saw different waves, which in some form replicates the waves of immigration from Europe to the rest of the so-called countries of recent settlement, like Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and to some extent the United States. So we see a jump after 1850s in the number of arrivals in Canada. Then the cycle decreased. We have another bump of increase in the 1880s, when the wave of land speculation in Manitoba and and to some extent to the west made that a great number of migrants, particularly from the east, moved to the western prairies, and then decline until the 1900 to experience a big jump after 1897, which 400,000 arrival in 1912, for instance, which was the biggest number of immigrants that arrived in Canada at that time. There are two versions, the pessimistic version and the optimistic version. So the pessimistic version said that from the 1870s, when Canada opened the prairie for settlement, until the 1900 was complete failure, because the number of settlers that really actually established in the prairie was very low. But after 1887, with a huge immigration effort from the government, they attracted a huge number of immigrants that coincide with what economists call the wheat boom. So the prairie started to show some productivity level that compared to other countries that were producing wheat at the time. By 1920, 1930, about 50,000 townships of 36 square miles were surveyed in what today are the prairie provinces. Each of these townships was subsequently divided into 36 sections of 1 square mile, and each of those sections were divided into the quarter section, the homestead. So the homestead were open. Some of the homesteads were open for settlement for the government. Where Section 8 and 26 were reserved for the Hudson's Bay Company in payment for the territory that the Crown obtained, and other townships were reserved for school purposes for the government, so they in the proper moment they could sell that land to provide for a school at the time. So, of course, that the things were not really that smooth as the government planned. So the number of homestead entries at the time were variable. We can see the similar pattern in this graph that shows the number of homestead entries and the percent of homestead cancellations. That shows the similarly pattern as the immigrants that arrived in Canada. So until the 1900s, we see a very low level of homestead entries or homestead application in the prairies, while by the 1900s on, the number of homestead applications skyrocket. And here again, so there is the negative and the positive view about the settlement of the prairie. What I see when I found, when I collected all the new data from the individual land offices was that from the period of lower settlement until 1887, the number of cancellation on average was about 43%. So half of the almost half of the settlers that arrived and tried to make a new life in the West failed. So they abandoned the settlement. So the positive view say that after 1897, settlers were more dynamic and they were better off than in the previous period. What I found was that the number of homestead application was higher than in the previous period, but the number of cancellation, the average of the percent of cancellation was about 39%, which is very high as well. So the number of homestead entries doesn't mean that there are bigger number of success in the settlement. So those who attempted to use the homestead applications as a means to understand a pattern of settlement, they dismissed the percent of cancellation on the period. So it's very difficult to understand where settlers actually settle or were successful with an aggregated data if we don't know disaggregate all this data by the location of land offices. So what I decided to do is to understand, to reconstruct the geography of the past by using GIS and attempting to recreate the area of influence of each of the land offices. There are no maps. I found only one map in, I think it was the 1890s, that shows the limits, the demarcation of the limit of each of the land offices, or the area of influence of each of the land office, which was really good to understand and to put into GIS, georeference that map put into GIS, and with the number of homestead entries and cancellation, do then some spatial analysis. But this was the only one, the only map that I found. So what I did was, okay, so I have the location of the land office. So I have the coordinate of each of the land offices. What I used was the Thyssen triangulation to simulate the area of influence of each of the land office. So as we see in the graph, given a set of known points, we can, with Thyssen triangulation, we can create a polygon that is a key distance from the different points in different distances. So, of course, this is not clearly the actual area of influence of each of the land office, but we can have a glimpse of what would have been the pattern of settlement according to the number of entries and cancellations in the area. Oh, what is it? I'll try to show you the map that I opened, which I don't know what it is. I think it's here. Okay. So what I did in GIS was, well, I did the Thyssen triangulation from what the land offices were not just regular. So the 1 year, the location of the land offices changed over time. So there was not just permanent. One office, according to the movement of the frontier of settlement, new land offices opened in the west. And over the years, some of those offices closed. So it wasn't just the making one map and use that map for all the period. So I have to do the Thyssen triangulation for each of the years. So we see in the, oh, you are not seeing this. Okay, so how can, this is the IT, I'm only seeing this. I cannot show this web page on the. This is PowerPoint and this is a web page. This is a local web page. It's not. So yeah, it's this one. Okay. Okay, here it is. On this side, the map shows the number of cancellations and the area of the land offices year by year. And in the other map on the right is the number of cancellations. So what can I do here is just play a little and try to understand if the successful settlement appear after 1 year, 2 years, and 3rd year. So according to the number of cancellations. So I can play with both maps and see. So I can see year by year. So the dark blue is the highest number of entries or cancellation, and the lighter blue is the lower number of entries and cancellation. So playing with year by year, we can have a sense of the movement of settlers. So where did settlers attempted to establish themselves, and according to the number of homestead entries that appear in that year, that the record show in that year. We can see also the expansion of the railroad network year by year, and we can try to attempt to establish a relationship between the movement of the railroad network and if there is any correlation with the higher number of homestead entries. So the railroad network attracted a great number of settlers because, well, they could travel easily than before because they didn't have so they didn't have to take the cart or horse or whatever to reach any destination. So the railroad approached them to further distances than before. So it is possible to, okay, so if the railroad wasn't there, it is a possibility that this area of that land office attracted more settlers than the others. So there are a number of questions that as an historian you can ask yourself to try to attempt, okay, so is this, how was the pattern of settlement in Western Canada? The other exercise to see, for instance, so that was in 1885. We have in the area of the open, the new open prairie. This area was almost virgin land in terms of agricultural productivity. So if settlers establish themselves in this area, they have to open up the land. So they have to they have to do a lot of works in order to get that land productive. So if they settle in this area, for instance, in which you have to do a lot of work, so how long it will take to them to abandon the homestead? Because, of course, the work of this land is about 1 year or more than 1 year. So you have to have savings for more than 1 year in order to be successful in any agricultural endeavor. So see if in 1886, we see in the cancellation of 1886, so a year after the settler established in this area, there is a high number of cancellation in the following year. So they just tried to open up the land there, so they were not very successful, and they just abandoned the homestead. That's according to the number of cancellation that we can find. So what about in the next year? So still there were settlers there in that area that attempt to make a living. So, and we see that there still is a higher number of cancellation after 2 years. So settlers were risk takers, but they were just in some cases in an adventure because they didn't know the land. So they came from Europe and from the east, that the condition of the agriculture were different. So they had to open up the land. So they had to attempt to be productive and make a living. So they had to live with the savings because they didn't have or open a small family farm. They have chickens and pork, etc., to make a living, and then attempt to make the homestead productive. So and what after the third year? So in 88. So it's still they were those settlers that still stay in the area, but after 3 years they were abandoned. And you can play with all the years and all the homestead entries and cancellation and see that the development of Western Canada was an uneven spread over the region. In this case, GIS helped me to see with another set or data set and disaggregated the data from individual land offices instead of using the aggregated data of homestead entries like cancellation as for the whole region. So it was very interesting. I have another map, which is an online map that I use OpenStreetMap as a base map, and OpenLayer 3 as the library, and the and I put another layers of post offices. So because the location of post offices was an indication of settlement, so but I couldn't open. So probably one of the browsers could not load the libraries and just open a blank page. So this is a failure, but yeah. So that is the way that I use GIS to do historical GIS.